My first ever visit to Lincoln was 35 years ago. I've been a few times since, but 35 years ago, I think it was a competition for Cubs or Scouts that you had to plan a trip and then execute it. And me and a friend of mine, we lived in Keyworth, south of Nottingham, and we got the bus into Nottingham, train to Newark, the bus to from Newark to Lincoln in order to find the Lincoln imp in the cathedral and take a photo and go home again. And the Lincoln imp was very small. It took me a long time to find it, but it was first time I'd ever done a trip that far, and it was very exciting. I'm told that the big frustration here in Lincoln is that the train service and the bus service are no better than 35 years ago. I'm not sure if that's right, but anyway, it wasn't great that day. It took a long time. And we've been here today at Siemens, which is clearly taken what is a very long-standing Lincoln business, but taken it to a new level. A new level in terms of its global reach and the success of the business now, but also the link up with the university is very innovative and very exciting. Often people think about university ideas being spread into business, but this is a genuine partnership where the university, with the business, is now training the next generation of engineers, not just for Siemens, but for the wider Lincoln economy. And when talking to the Siemens guys, they clearly think that other companies are now going to come to Lincoln to share in the benefit of that. So that could only be good for the town. Well, I had a lunch before coming to Siemens at Lindum, a big company here, with Lucy Rigby, our Labour candidate, and we had people from the local economic partnership, the LEP, from banks, the IOD, from the Chamber of Commerce, private businesses. People were saying to me, we need to build more homes, because there's a real shortage of houses here, not just in Lincoln, but in the wider region. You need to invest in transport links. Business rates are a big challenge, especially in the market town high streets. Businesses want more of a say in apprenticeships and skills planning. We need to stay in the European Union because we can't walk away from that big single market. And these are all things that we want to work with local businesses on, because unless we respond to that, we're not going to get the investment and the jobs we need for the future. We need to reform the European Union. We need to control immigration. We need to make the common agricultural policy work better. There's lots of things we need to do to reform Europe, but it's our biggest single market, and to walk away from it would be foolish. There's a good phrase in our language: don't cut off your nose to spite your face. And it would be cutting off our nose to spite our face to leave Europe. There's no doubt, as far as I can see, a company like Siemens here, selling all around the world. They're here because there's tradition, there's a skilled workforce, there's good university links, and because we're part of the European Union. And that's the same is true for Honda and Nissan and Toyota, for scores of companies across our country. To walk away from that single market would be very foolish, and David Cameron and George Osborne may play politics with Europe and the referendum issue. We're going to make sure we put investment and jobs first. To get skills, it's very hard if you're a small business to take all the risk of an apprenticeship on your own shoulders and your own balance sheet, but there's things we can do to improve that. I also think that we do need to make sure that finance works in a fair way. That means making sure that banks are operating in a competitive and fair way, but we actually, there's a market gap. We would set up a British investment bank to provide start-up and early stage funding for small businesses. And you need to make sure that the way in which credit is offered is being done in a fair way. And we are hearing stories of companies where they're not getting their money back for 2 or 3 days, but for longer periods of time, because credit card companies and banks are holding on to that money to make sure that they don't end up bearing the risk. I'm not sure whether that's always fair, and that's something which we're going to keep a close eye on. What the figures tell us in the last few years is that investment in affordable housing has been cut back sharply. We have fewer housing starts than at any time since the 1920s. It's actually astonishing that a council like Lincoln here is managing to build the first council houses for 20 years, despite the lack of support from the central government. I want us to change that. I want us to be leading the way as a government on affordable houses and house building. And that means you've got to be willing to invest, but you've also got to be willing to plan for the future. We need new towns. We need to have corporations which can bring in the infrastructure and get the benefits. It needs to be done in a way which is sensitive, because we don't want to be concreting over Greenbelt. We need to make sure we protect countryside, but we also need to build homes and get the jobs and skills which come from that. And that's something which we're determined to do, but it's got to be much more ambitious than we're seeing currently from George Osborne. We want to see our corporation tax system being competitive. We reduced corporation tax in government labour from 33 to 28, and the current government's gone further than that. And we want to keep a low corporation tax rates to be competitive. But we've said we think the next stage, the next cut next year, is actually not the priority now. We won't go ahead with the next cut in corporation tax, the final cut in your list. We'd instead use that money to cut and freeze business rates for all small businesses. And talking to people here in Lincoln and Lincolnshire, I think help on business rates for small businesses and retailers is a bigger priority than another cut in corporation tax rate. So that will be how we'll do things differently.
Just the very fact of having the referendum, or being seen to be, that everyone knows that if the Conservatives get a majority at the next election in 10 months' time, then there will be an EU referendum. And polling at the moment, I think, shows people want to stay in the European Union. But that could change. That could get tighter. I think it's a risk. I think it's a risk for Lincoln and for jobs, quite frankly, for investment that we've got here, because I think the fear is that because we may have a referendum, companies may be thinking to themselves, there's less point investing in the UK because there's a chance that we may leave the EU. Frankly, I find it difficult to believe that Siemens would be here in Lincoln if we weren't part of the European Union, because such a large part of the benefit for them of being here is having access to being part of this huge market. But look, it's not just about Siemens, it's about companies like Dynex, who are, I think, quite a large part of their funding now is, not funding, but ownership perhaps, comes from China. Now, would the Chinese be investing and have invested so much in this Lincoln company if we didn't have automatic access, they didn't have automatic access to the rest of Europe via Lincoln? I think these are really, really important questions, and frankly, the possibility that we might be about to leave the world's largest trading bloc, I think would be bad for our city and bad for Britain. So the business lunch that we had earlier today, it was really important for me that we had different sized companies there, and we had representatives from people who were part of business networks who themselves represent thousands and thousands of small businesses. And actually I think a lot of what the Labour Party has been talking about, a lot of what arguably the national conversation should be about, is about small businesses, because you're right, I do believe that they are the lifeblood of our economy, and unfortunately small and medium-sized businesses we heard today are struggling still in terms of business rates. For one, we know that 1 in 10 small companies pays more in rates than they do in rent, so that's why I think the plan that Ed Balls has to freeze and cut and then freeze rather business rates will really help small and medium-sized businesses. I think the other problem that they have, that they still have, is about access to finance. I mean, since the crash, I don't think that we've seen lending to small and medium-sized companies recover to the extent that we would like it to. If you can't borrow money, if you can't get lending on decent terms, then you can't take on more employees. You can't do all the things that actually the economy here in Lincoln needs people to do.